So, hello everyone, and welcome to the week two roundup. We've been looking at influences and afterlives in particular this week. I'm Gillian Dow, who designed the course with my colleagues a few years ago. This is the 11th run now, and I'm here with Asha, who's one of our second year students at the University of Southampton. Asha, you've been looking through the material for the first time on this run of the course. What particularly struck you about what we were looking at this week?
I think probably the impact of her family on her legacy has been one of the biggest things for me. Especially, well, also looking at all the different portraits of her and how she was portrayed, and the fact that the one certain portrait that we have, she's not even looking at us. So there's a definite sense of mystery. And it was very funny reading her brother's account of her, which said she always had the correct opinions and she was very kind to everyone and generally very demure and Victorian.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Victorian age didn't just start with Queen Victoria, did it? There was lots of that sense of, the angel in the house, and
Mm.
the domestic goddess, I suppose, as it were, even before. And I used the word hagiography in relation to that biography that Henry wrote of his sister. And that's a word for the lives of the saints, something that really raises people up onto this sort of saintly pedestal. And that's absolutely what he's doing in that biographical preface to her final two publications, of course, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, novels written in very different periods. I mean, she was working on Northanger Abbey in the 1790s. Persuasion was her last completed novel, but they're published together just a few months after her death in December 1817. And he writes this biographical preface, which, as you say, Asha, really turns her into this better than wonderful kind of hallowed creature, saintly creature, which is very unlike the Austen we know. Now, can you think of other women writers who had a similar kind of treatment in this period, or perhaps a very different kind of treatment?
Yeah, well, I think it definitely reminded me of Mary Wollstonecraft because after her death, her husband published biography of her, but it was so scandalous because he wrote so truthfully about her life and what she'd been up to and what she was like in a way that, yeah, I suppose shocked people when it was published, which meant that it tarnished her reputation and it meant that people's opinions of her were definitely coloured in a way that he obviously didn't intend for. So I think, following that, Jane Austen's family would have been very concerned about the impact that her biography would would have on the public and how they remembered her. Because it's important for women to be seen as perfect and to be seen as always thoughtful and polite and decent. And I suppose also it just made me think about Cassandra burning Austen's letters and the scandals that might have been contained therein that the family was desperately trying to keep under wraps.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Asha. So Mary Wollstonecraft's an interesting, very interesting comparison. She's a near contemporary of Jane Austen's. The two women are very
Yeah.
unalike in lots of ways. I mean, she had this public persona. She very specifically said that she was the first of a new genus, so she was going to make her living through her writing. She was going to fend for herself. She had a child out of wedlock. All sorts of scandalous things in Wollstonecraft's life. William Godwin's memoir of his wife is an absolutely beautiful piece of writing, and I recommend it to all participants on the course highly. But it was very unsuited for the time. His wife had died. Mary Wollstonecraft had died just a few days after giving birth to their daughter, who was to become Mary Shelley, the great novelist. And he was, traumatized by this, and understandably so, and still grieving, and published this kind of outpouring of emotion in which he presented his wife, kind of warts and all, to the public, and that was something that Jane Austen's family certainly would not have wanted to do. Not perhaps specifically because of what happened to Mary Wollstonecraft, but just because they wanted to present their sister as a private, not a public woman. And that's a very important distinction in this period, I think, to make sure that everybody understood that she was first and foremost a God-fearing Christian. And that really comes across. Your reference to Cassandra is important too. I've popped in one of the comments to that the section that looks at Henry's biographical preface, an article by Juliet Wells that's really suggestive about who actually wrote that biographical preface and how much was Henry's account influenced by Cassandra. She was the sibling who knew Jane best. She must have been consulted on it, surely. We know that the next generation, when Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, was working on his biography, which was to come out in 1869, so much later on, he consulted his sister and he consulted other female descendants, but the biography came out in his name and his name alone. So again, the next generation are doing this sort of public-private. It's the men who publish, the women are behind the scenes. I think it's likely that that's what Cassandra's involvement in the biographical preface too. But of course, there is no evidence for this. There is very little evidence. And the point you make about Cassandra burning the letters, why did she do it? What did she burn? We simply don't know. There's been really interesting speculation. Certainly she would have wanted to protect perhaps other family members from cruel accounts. Perhaps what she wanted to do most was protect her sister's authorial presentation. And I think the letters that remain do that. The accounts of receiving Pride and Prejudice from the publishers for the first time, the accounts of negotiations with John Murray II, who was to publish Emma and to go on to publish her final two novels. That's very much there. Cassandra kept that. So I think there was a deliberate kind of construction of her sister as author after on, but that's, very speculative. People who want to speculate some more on this could pick up Jill Hornby's Miss Austen, which of course was adapted this year by the BBC as a drama. I thought it was wonderful. It's fiction, but sometimes Austen's life is best thought through via fiction because there is so very little tangible evidence. So that was one of the interesting things that about the course this week. People have been engaging with certain aspects. Were there any particular questions that you thought we should address, Asha?
Yes, we had a question about Englishness and whether or not Jane Austen was creating that, which I think is interesting in terms of thinking about the 18th century as a whole period.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This sort of sense that the nation is being forged in the 18th century. I'm going to refer people to Linda Colley's Britons, Forging the Nation 1707 to 1837, which is a great work of historiography. Linda Colley's a historian, and it's very much looking at, how the nation state got built, how Britons became British in the 18th century. In terms of the literature of earlier periods, it's very much what Edmund Spenser is doing in The Fairy Queen, isn't it? He's designing what England should be. Shakespeare does it too via his history plays. Austen's not the first to do this, but she certainly thinks very interestingly about what it is to be English via her novels. And I think one example that I think doesn't come up at all in the course, but is an interesting passage to think about, is Henry Tilney's words to Catherine Morland at the end of Northanger Abbey, when Catherine Morland discovers that she's been inventing all these fantasies around what happened to Henry Tilney's mother, Mrs. Tilney. How did she die? And Henry Tilney says to her, "Remember, we are English." and it's a sort of extraordinary passage, and it always makes me think of this historian Linda Colley's work, which is Englishness is, as much as anything in the 18th century, defined as not being French. So what Henry Tilney is saying is, we're here, we're in England, we are not on the continent. He says, remember, we are Christian. But what he really means is, remember, we're Protestant. We're not like these Catholics across the channel. We do things differently here. People should have a look at that passage. I always think there's so much to get out of it in terms of a sort of xenophobia he's highlighting, and perhaps a kind of negative sense of what it means to be living in a neighborhood with a network of spies. So people can go back to that passage and have a look at it. It's an interesting one. Other questions for us very specifically this week? What were the other things we wanted to pick up on?
We had a question about the play in Mansfield Park and what specifically is about the play that causes such anxieties.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Mansfield Park is such a rich novel from all perspectives, really. But I think the thing about the play is when one picks up that novel and looks at where the section and the performance in the play is, it's bang in the middle. So this is absolutely central. The rehearsing of the play, the deciding of the characters, and then Sir Thomas's return from his plantations in Antigua sits right at the middle of the novel. There's a before and there's an after. And I think what we were trying to do this week on the course is really get people to have a proper think about the theatre in relation to Austen. And as the course is making clear, and as people no doubt know, Jane Austen loved the theatre. She loved going to the theatre. It was a family who performed private theatricals in their own home too. So, these scenes with the Bertrams and their friends, the Crawfords, and Henry Rushworth, that all of these people choosing a play and rehearsing it for performance is something that the Austen family did. Jane's elder brother, James, at Steventon, put on a variety of plays. Jane was very engaged and involved in that. And we know also that when she and Cassandra were at Godmersham Park, so rich brother Edward's house in 1805, she's very much involved in getting the next generation to perform plays too. So this was not an unacceptable thing. What do you think might have been unacceptable then in this case? What was it? What is it in the novel that the characters shouldn't be doing or don't want to be doing?
I'm not sure. I don't know specifically. I do think it's interesting also considering Austen and Shakespeare, which people were thinking about in the course, that it did make me think about when Hamlet puts on the play for the king and the ways in which plays sometimes show us uncomfortable truths about society and ourselves that people, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Asha. Of course, there's a play within a play in A Midsummer Night's Dream as well, and all the confusion around that. So this is
it's quite a Shakespearean quality.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are lots of influences of Shakespeare on Jane Austen, of course, and that very specific reference in Mansfield Park to Shakespeare being part of an Englishman's constitution. So if people go back to the novel and look at what Henry Crawford's saying about Shakespeare and acting in general, that it will be interesting. I think the key thing with the performance of Lovers' Vows is it's not so much the performance of a play full stop, it's that play and with those characters. So there's a great danger in having Henry Crawford and Maria Bertram rehearsing those scenes. Lovers' Vows is about a fallen woman. And, having an unmarried but engaged woman rehearsing those scenes with someone who she's not engaged to and is not a family member is genuinely of concern. It's of great concern to Edmund, and Fanny almost asserts her moral worth by refusing to have any part of it. And so when Thomas Bertram comes back and the characters have all been behaving in this way, it is a real moment of rupture. And there's a sort of rottenness at the centre of Mansfield Park. You know, the moral core is corrupt, and it's corrupt because of that play. I should say that I'd read the play many times, but the first time I actually saw it performed was about a decade ago. And the play is actually really very funny as well as moving. I mean, it was originally a German play, and what Jane Austen's talking about is a woman called Elizabeth Inchbald's translation of it.
Right.
And you know, there's a rhyming butler scene that's hilarious. There's very moving scenes too, but I think it's the content matter of that play rather than plays full stop.
Well, it's probably also like the humor, because that humor is used to make uncomfortable things more palatable. And obviously, having sympathetic accounts of fallen women is very scandalous. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. The other thing that's just reminded me of actually in terms of Jane Austen's artistic development is she's one of quite few writers in the period who only writes novels. So when
Mm.
we think about some of her contemporaries, you know, we started by talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote novels, not very good ones, I'm afraid, but she did write novels and brilliant works of proto-feminism and travel writing. We think about
Mhm.
Elizabeth Inchbald, who I've just mentioned as being a translator of this German play. She was also a novelist. You know, so women worked as playwrights, they worked as novelists. There wasn't this clear differentiation between genres in the period. Jane Austen is one of the very few writers to only write novels and not write anything else. But we do know that she wrote poetry for her family's enjoyment. And we
Yeah,
do know, so in Chawton House Library, there's a little play for family performance that is certainly in her handwriting, although
yeah.
it's also almost certainly not written by her. And that little play
Interesting.
is an adaptation of Richardson's big novel, you know, 5 volumes, absolutely huge, Sir Charles Grandison, which was one of her favorite
Mhm.
novels. So yeah, lots of crossover between fiction and theatre in this period, and certainly lots for people to keep thinking about. So that's probably enough from us for today. Keep commenting, everyone. We hope you're enjoying the course. Next week, we'll be moving on to adaptation and legacy and thinking about Austen in translation, adaptations of Austen, and thinking about how we curate exhibitions around either her fiction or her life, or indeed both. So we look forward to reading your comments, and thank you very much again for joining us.